Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we have a special comment regarding the modern country music scene. In the year 2000, two of the greatest country acts of the decade teamed up to perform a song formerly written by bluegrass artists Larry Cordle and Larry Shell. The song was never released as a single, but received significant airplay anyway due to its controversial nature in the country music industry. It was a song about how traditional and neo-traditional country music, and the performers who made it, were being shoved to the sidelines in favor of mainstream pop crossover success. The song spoke of how artists like Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, and George Jones would never have had success in this industry climate. They, and the culture and history that they represented, would have been ignored. The legends, the icons of the genre, would have likely been forgotten. The song was titled Murder on Music Road, and was made a hit by Alan Jackson and George Strait. And the situation of which they are singing? Well, it's happening again. On September 12th, the Nashville Scene published a breakdown of the lyrics of the top 20 songs of the country music charts, indicating a common lyrical thread and the genre shift towards party songs centered on beer, trucks, and girls. The case that the article made was not to highlight the individual successes and failures of the songs on this list, but to point out the astounding similarities between the songs in terms of subject matter, theme, and even lyrical content. Furthermore, given that the extreme majority of these acts were performed by solo male country acts, the argument could be made that for the average listener, they could not tell these particular men apart. There is only one song on this list fronted by a woman, Carrie Underwood, and I would have a hard time calling the American Idol winner a country singer instead of a pop star. On the list of songs, the noticeable outliers came from Tim McGraw, a stalwart of the genre who's been around for decades, and a song penned by Bob Dylan sung by Darius Rucker, the former frontman of Hootie and the Blowfish. Neither song, I might add, were in the top 10. Then on September 19th, Billboard magazine released an article showing how a growing number of country acts in the mainstream are showing some degree of concern regarding the sameness of their peers' content. Zac Brown of the Zac Brown Band said, "There is not a lot in the country format that I enjoy listening to. If I hear one more Tailgate in the Moonlight Daisy Duke song, I want to throw up. There are songs out right now on the radio that make me ashamed to even be in the same format as some of those artists." Think about that for a moment. The frontman of a critically acclaimed country act from rural Georgia, from a town of just over 5,000 people, made the statement that he is ashamed to be in the same format as some of his peers. He goes on to call Luke Bryan's That's Kind of Night the worst song he has ever heard. He goes on to target the country music industry, saying, "It puts songs and people on a pedestal that have no integrity to them whatsoever." And to the writers of these songs, you can look on song credits and see some of the same songwriters on every one. There's been like 10 number one songs in the last 2 to 3 years that were written by the same people, and the exact same words, just arranged in different ways. Zac Brown is right. So is Gary Allan, who said in an interview with Larry King, said, I feel we have lost our genre. So is Casey Musgraves, who said in an interview with British GQ in August when asked about what trends in music need to die, she replied, anyone singing about trucks, in any form, in any song, anywhere. Literally, just stop. Nobody cares. It's not fun to listen to. Unfortunately, Miss Musgraves is likely wrong on this front, at least in comparison with the programming that Nashville has been pushing on country radio for the past few years, because it has become abundantly clear that a growing audience wants this style of music. Incidentally, Casey Musgraves released an album this year, titled Same Trailer, Different Park, a controversial yet critically acclaimed debut album, where she spoke openly such as on deteriorating rural culture, religion, and even same-sex marriage. It is one of the best albums of the year, on that note, and will beat out Daft Punk, Kanye West, Vampire Weekend, Deer Hunter, The National, and a slew of other critically acclaimed acts on my personal top 10. Yet outside of major professional publications, Robert Christgau, and AllMusic, this album was ignored. In most top 10 lists by mainstream critics at the end of this year, I suspect it will be forgotten, and while it has sold better than you might expect, reaching number 2 on the Billboard 200, it was far from a smash hit. with the lead single only reaching number 14. Oh, and the album it was up against that week, the major competition the label was setting Miss Musgraves up against? Justin Timberlake's comeback album, The 2020 Experience, which proceeded to sell approximately 968,000 copies that week alone. That week, same week incidentally, Casey Musgraves sold about 42,000. For a more fitting comparison, the previous week, Luke Bryan sold 150,000 copies of a compilation album, a glorified spring break mixtape. Now, I'm not here to make a value judgment on whether or not I think the trend towards mainstream is a bad thing. As much in mainstream country is in all of its varieties not really my thing, I can acknowledge good music when I hear it, and there is some there. But what I think is much more worrying trend is a sidelining of promising new acts like Casey Musgraves, a female singer-songwriter with incredible chops, fresh ideas, and an excellent sense of solid country music with a backing in tradition and history, in favor of meat-headed, practically interchangeable male country stars who have pop crossover success by catering to the lowest common denominator. From a business point of view, Nashville is making a killing on these country acts, but it does not reflect a sustainable business model when you put your most promising singer-songwriter in a decade up against Justin Timberlake on her debut week. But at the same time, the country music industry is a business. And if they want to milk and oversaturate the market with mainstream male country acts to roll in the dough until everybody gets sick of them, that's their choice. But there is a much bigger issue at stake here and is reflected in the comments made by Casey Musgraves, Gary Allan, and Zach Brown. The loss of culture and flavor in country music. A loss of texture and the feeling that the songs are informed by authentic, real emotions and songwriters who know their history and the place country music has played in the pop culture of the United States for nearly a century. At this point, Nashville seems to have completely forsaken this, presumably under the belief that nobody in their audience wants it. The strange thing is that more and more of this evidence is coming to light that is not the case. Recently, I reviewed the new album released by country singer Justin Moore, titled Off the Beaten Path. Now, that album was terrible, and I stand by everything I said about it, but it was something in the comments of that video that both concerned me and got me thinking, because people jumped to the defense of Justin Moore, and not just because they thought his music was good, but because they thought his music was relatable. They could connect with it. They saw in that offensive, pandering nonsense that was that album with little moments that which they could connect. It was something, at least. And they gravitated toward those songs about small-town USA and God and rural culture and all of that, not solely because they were something that they could relate to, but because mainstream country has nearly completely abandoned that specific demographic in favor of catering to a mainstream audience. Or worse still, they attempt to appease that demographic with shallow, vapid pandering that looks and sounds utterly soulless. And yet, the audience, well, they'll take anything they can get. And frankly, I can empathize with their concerns. Their defense of Justin Moore, who at least seems to believe the crap that he's selling, is pretty much identical to my defense of Casey Musgraves, at least in basic principles. We're both looking for culture in our country music. So, what happened? How did we get here? What led Nashville to throw their history and their culture under the tires of a Chevy truck lining up for a tailgate? Well, there's a lot of factors in that. One I can definitely pinpoint is within the country music industry itself. They've always gone for the mainstream audience and the massive dollars that come with it, with country pop rising in the late 70s and 80s and the explosion of Garth Brooks and Shania Twain in the 90s. But those climates, there were still stalwarts in neo-traditional country, like Alan Jackson and George Strait, who fought to preserve their history and culture, and an audience that supported that. But when Nashville found out that they could appease that demographic by pandering to Southern pride and small-town nationalist spirit and patriotism, those that fought for culture and history were forced to the sidelines. And how can Nashville possibly get away with this, you might ask? Well, that's a twofold problem, and here's where things actually begin to get ugly. Because one of the groups that deserve blame are modern music critics, like myself, particularly those who are my age and a little bit older. The majority of critics outside of major publications like AllMusic and Rolling Stone and Entertainment Weekly, who must cover country pretty much by obligation and obligation only, have ignored and marginalized country music for a long time now, preferring to cover the newest underground hip-hop mixtape or independent album that nobody outside of a very, very small community of music nerds will ever care about. I could go on about how this attitude completely betrays the spirit of populism, which the best critics have always embraced, but that misses the meat of the message. By ignoring country music, the critical press shut down the artistic conversation within country music. They made the implicit statement that there is no artistry or craft or intelligence or meaningful commentary in country music. And I would be remiss to not mention the political angle, where certain people, ignorant of country music as a genre, dismissed it as music for small-town, right-leaning, white trash rednecks, who are incapable of appreciating better music. This sort of thinking in dismissal is cowardly, shameful, disgusting, and utterly despicable, and it shows most critics as narrow-minded as the demographic that they dismissed. But the country music industry heard that message, and they realized they didn't need critical acclaim to sell records anymore, unlike other genres like metal and indie rock and occasionally hip-hop. They didn't need us as critics. So they started catering to the lowest common denominator even more aggressively than they ever have before, putting money and professional songwriters behind anyone with a hint of talent, and they reaped the rewards, particularly considering the culture of anti-intellectualism and victimization that was being adopted by the stagnating and unfairly ignored rural population of the United States. And while I will not claim that country music was directly responsible for shoving large tracts of the US towards the right politically, you can't deny that with the success of acts like Jason Aldean and Justin Moore, and libelous songs like Have You Forgotten by Daryl Worley, that rightward shift did not happen. And with the role that country music played in the culture, in the aftermath of 9/11, things got even worse. As much as I have never, ever liked the Dixie Chicks, they didn't deserve to have their careers ruined because they were right about the war on terror before everyone else realized it. Like it or not, country music has contributed to the increased polarization of America, and the critics not doing their jobs by ignoring covering country music have only made things worse, because the cultural conversation between those coastal media elites and the rest of America had stopped. So, thus, I wasn't surprised that I got comments on my country music reviews saying that I shouldn't even be covering country music because I'm a Canadian city boy and thus I must be some sort of privileged white-collar commie homosexual. Even though I've been listening to country music for about 20 years. Even though I know more about country music than I know about hip-hop or metal or electronica. I freely admit this. Even though I am perhaps the only critic on YouTube who even bothers to cover country music at all, or review it fairly, or to give it a goddamn chance. And sure, YouTube is an echo chamber, and any critical opinion gets pounced upon. But there is something very different about this, because it reflects the fact that there is something very seriously wrong with the shape that country music is taking, that acts like Justin Moore are making money simply because they can pander to rural pride and nationalism, and the starving audiences will take anything that they can get. And as Zach Brown said in his interview, country fans and country listeners deserve to have something better than that. A song that really has something to say. Good music makes you feel something. So, what's the solution to this? Honestly, I have no idea. If I could solve the increased polarization of the United States, I probably would not be reviewing albums on the internet. What I will say is this: the increased popularity of country acts in the mainstream will not last. At this point, the market is nearly saturated, and when trends shift, and when the mainstream public gets sick of country, as they inevitably will, it is going to ruin a lot of careers. Right now, however, I am significantly more concerned about two groups. The artists, who are suffering now because the industry is sidelining them and neglecting them, and who might never get another chance in the spotlight, and those concerned about American culture and history at large, particularly those who love country music and don't want to see that genre implode in the same way that other oversaturated genres collapse throughout history, like disco, and prog rock, and punk, and hair metal, and grunge, and punk again. But country is unique in this element, because so much of it is linked directly and is informed by American culture and American history. If you forget where your culture comes from, then the people who represent it, instead of those who are just looking to profit from it and looking in order to make a quick buck, you lose something that you can never get back. Alan Jackson and George Strait understood this when they recorded Murder on Music Row back in the year 2000. And really, The only reasons that pop country imploded at the end of the 90s the way it did are the near simultaneous failures of Garth Brooks and Shania Twain's follow-up albums and 9/11, where Nashville correctly and fortunately realized that the United States needed a connection with its culture and its roots stronger than ever, or else the blow to this nation's spirit would never heal. But this time, things are different. I don't see that tragedy in our future, and hopefully it will never come. But I also don't see a good ending for traditional country music. Or, let's put this another way. This week, Alan Jackson dropped a new album. How many of you have heard of it? Or how many of you even realized that he was putting out a new album? Yeah, that's what I thought. I don't want to see another murder on Music Row. And so why do I care? Well, for the same reasons that Alan Jackson, George Strait, and Zac Brown, and Gary Allan, and Casey Musgraves care. I love country music. As an art form, I believe it has strength as an art. And there's room on the charts for both culture and partying. To quote Zac Brown one more time, I'm opinionated because I care so much about the music and the song. You know what? He's not alone.